Vivid verses.
I learned to read runes the way some people read books, quickly, with the lights on, noticing which pages had been dog-eared and which had been carefully smoothed back into place. It was a skill I developed over years of working in contract negotiation, where the space between what someone said and what they meant was often the most profitable real estate in the room. My firm, Caldwell and Voss, handled commercial disputes for mid-sized companies, the kind of work that required you to be simultaneously patient and relentless, to notice things without appearing to notice them, and to let the other side believe they were winning right up until the moment they weren't. I had an office on the 14th floor of the Hargrove building on Callaway Street in downtown Fenwick, a mid-sized city that had been trying to rebrand itself as a financial hub for the better part of a decade. Fenwick had the bones for it. A decent downtown corridor, a university on the western edge that produced a steady stream of finance and law graduates, and a port that kept the shipping and logistics sector active enough to generate the kind of commercial disputes that paid my mortgage comfortably. My name is Conrad Ashby. I was 36 years old, ran 4 miles every morning before work, and had a standing reservation at Pellegrino's, a small Italian restaurant on the corner of Barker and Vine, every Friday evening, whether I had company or not. I liked the ritual. I liked knowing where I'd be and why. Structure wasn't a cage for me. It was a foundation. Everything else I built on top of it. I mention all of this because context matters. Who you are before someone enters your life determines, in large part, how clearly you can see them. I met Vanessa Holt at a dinner party hosted by my colleague, Owen Fitch, in early September. Owen threw these gatherings every few months at his townhouse in the Lakeview district. 8 to 12 people, good wine, the kind of conversation that occasionally surprised you. He had a talent for putting together rooms where the guests were just different enough from each other to generate friction, but not so different that dinner collapsed into argument. Vanessa was seated across from me. She was attractive in a precise, composed way. Dark hair, sharp cheekbones, the kind of posture that suggested she was always aware of being observed. She worked in brand strategy, she told me, for a consultancy called Prism Group that operated out of offices on the north side of Fenwick. She was articulate without being performative, funny in a dry, understated way that I genuinely appreciated, and she had an interesting habit of asking questions that seemed casual but were actually quite pointed. I noticed that too. Filed away. We talked for most of the dinner about the city's development corridor, about a restaurant that had just opened near the port, about a book we'd both read on behavioral economics. She was engaging. I don't want to minimize that. Whatever came later, Vanessa was genuinely interesting to talk to, and I don't believe in rewriting the early chapters of story to make the ending feel inevitable. She gave me her number before the party ended. I texted her the following Tuesday, and we had dinner at a place called the Wren on Prospect Avenue the Friday after. It was easy, comfortable. She laughed at the right things. She held her opinions with confidence, but without rigidity, or so it seemed. We became a couple gradually, and then, as these things tend to go, quite suddenly. By November, we were seeing each other 2 or 3 times a week. By December, she had a drawer in my apartment in the Caldwell Heights neighborhood, a 3rd-floor unit in a building called Arrowhaven that I'd lived in for 4 years and genuinely liked. I was, by any reasonable measure, happy. The first thing I noticed was the calendar. It was subtle enough that I almost dismissed it. In mid-December, Vanessa mentioned that she'd moved one of my Friday morning client calls for me because I'd been stressed about scheduling. She said it almost in passing, the way you'd mention having picked up someone's dry cleaning. She'd reached out to the client's assistant directly, she explained, and shifted the call to Thursday afternoon. I was briefly taken aback, but chose not to make an issue of it. She meant it kindly. The client hadn't complained. I let it go, but I noted it. In January, it happened again. I'd mentioned, once, briefly, that a dinner I had scheduled with 2 former law school friends, Perry and Declan conflicted with a deadline I was pushing against. 3 days later, Vanessa told me she'd message Perry and let him know I needed to postpone. Perry had texted me separately, something light. "Vanessa's got you on a tight leash, mate." He'd meant it as a joke. I read it twice. I didn't say anything to Vanessa that evening. I smiled, thanked her, and spent 20 minutes after she fell asleep lying in the dark thinking carefully about what I actually wanted to say. The question wasn't whether she'd done something technically harmful. She hadn't. The question was what the behavior represented and whether it would, left unaddressed, compound. Everything compounds if you let it. I brought it up the following weekend over breakfast at my kitchen table. I was measured. I told her I appreciated that she was trying to help, but that I needed to manage my own schedule. That it wasn't about the specific incidents, but about a principle I held, that my professional and personal commitments were mine to arrange. She apologized, warmly and apparently sincerely. She said she had a tendency to over-organize, that it was a flaw she'd been working on, that she hadn't meant to overstep. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine, and I believed her, or at least I believed that she believed herself. I noted in the back of my mind that the apology had been quite polished. February arrived, and so did what I'd come to think of, privately, as the escalation. It wasn't dramatic. That's important to understand. If it had been dramatic, if she'd gone through my phone or shown up at my office unannounced, I would have addressed it cleanly and immediately. I've never had much patience for scenes. But the escalation was architectural. It built itself quietly in the background, while leaving the foreground looking perfectly normal. She began mentioning my schedule before I did. She'd reference appointments I hadn't told her about. She knew, for instance, that I had a mediation session on the second Tuesday of February before I'd mentioned it. I'd seen a look cross her face when I confirmed it over the phone with the opposing counsel, a flicker of something that might have been satisfaction at already knowing. She was familiar with a venue I'd booked for a client dinner in a way that couldn't be explained by coincidence or inference. I didn't say anything. I listened. I watched. I began to think about how she could have access to this information without my providing it, and the answers I arrived at were not comfortable ones. I also noticed, and this was perhaps more instructive than anything else, that my social life had quietly contracted. It hadn't happened by force. There had been no ultimatums, no scenes. But there had been a steady, low-level friction applied to every plan that didn't include her. A slight coolness when I mentioned plans with Perry and Declan. A logistical comment at just the right moment that made rescheduling feel easier than keeping the original arrangement. An expressed tiredness on evenings when she knew I'd planned to attend something without her. None of it was provable. All of it was effective. I'm a contract negotiator. I understand incremental concession. I understand the value of making each individual ask seem small enough to accept, while the aggregate of those asks quietly dismantles everything you started with. I recognized the structure even while I was inside it. The question I had to sit with was this conscious or was it compulsive? Was Vanessa running a deliberate campaign, or was she operating from some deep anxiety that expressed itself this way? It mattered less than people might think. The effect was the same either way. The event that clarified my decision, that moved me from contemplation to action, was an incident on the last Friday in February. I had dinner plans, Pellegrino's, my standing Friday reservation, but with a guest this time, my older sister, Margot, who was visiting Fenwick for a conference and had called me earlier that week to see if we could catch up. I've been looking forward to it. Margot lived 3 hours away in Crestholme, and I didn't see her often enough. I told Vanessa about it on Wednesday. She smiled and said to have a lovely time. On Friday morning, I got a call from Pellegrino's. My reservation had been moved from 7 o'clock to 5:30. The person who'd called to change it had given my name. When I asked the host whether the caller had been a man or a woman, he paused and then said, quite carefully, that he believed it had been a woman. 5:30 didn't work. Margot's last conference session ran until 6. I called the restaurant back and restored the original time without drama. Then I stood in my office for a moment looking out over Callaway Street at the gray February sky. That was the moment. Not the act itself, but what it confirmed. This was an anxiety. Anxiety doesn't make targeted, tactical moves. Anxiety doesn't call a restaurant and change a reservation under someone else's name. That required intent. That required planning. That was the behavior of someone who had decided, for reasons I didn't yet fully understand, to manage me. I thought about the access to my schedule, the quiet erosion of my social engagements, the polished apology back in January that had resolved nothing, the consistent structural pressure being applied to the shape of my life. I had dinner with Margot at 7 o'clock. It was genuinely lovely. She looked well. We ate too much pasta, and she made me laugh until I had to put my fork down. I didn't mention Vanessa. I wasn't ready to talk about it yet, and I don't process things well out loud until I know exactly what I think. I knew what I thought by the time I walked home. I called Vanessa on Saturday morning and asked her to come over. I didn't give her a reason. She arrived at 11, looking composed and carrying 2 coffees from the place on my street, Anchor Grounds, that she knew I liked. It was a gracious gesture, and I noticed it for what it was, a small, preemptive act of goodwill, a buffer. I offered her a seat at the kitchen table and sat down across from her. Same table where I'd had the January conversation. She set the coffees between us and looked at me with an expression that was almost entirely calm, with something else sitting very quietly underneath it. I'm ending this, I said. I didn't preface it. There was nothing to be gained by prefacing it. She held my gaze for a moment and then looked down at the coffee cups. Conrad, you've been managing my schedule, I said. Not helping. Managing. You moved my Friday dinner last night. You've been accessing information about my calendar that I haven't given you. You've applied pressure, subtle pressure, but pressure to virtually every social commitment I have that doesn't involve you. And when I addressed it in January, the behavior didn't stop. It just became more careful. I haven't, she started, and then stopped. She was intelligent enough to know that denial wasn't a viable position, which told me she'd already considered this conversation. I've been concerned about you, she said instead. You spread yourself too thin. I've been trying to. Help, I said. I know. That's how it was framed in January too. I kept my voice even. I'm not angry with you, but I'm not someone who can be managed, and I'm not going to become someone who can be. The pattern you've established isn't something I'm willing to accommodate, and it's not going to change because we have a conversation about it. We've already had that conversation. She was quiet. I watched her process the fact that there wasn't going to be a negotiation, that I wasn't presenting this as a problem to be solved or an ultimatum to be bargained down. I was presenting it as a conclusion. Something shifted in her expression. I'd seen it before in difficult negotiations. The moment when the other party recognizes that the position they prepare to defend isn't actually the one being contested. She'd prepared, I suspected, for an accusation, for an argument, for raised voices, and the kind of emotional disorder that can be navigated and redirected. She hadn't prepared for calm. There are things you don't know, she said. Her voice had changed, slightly tighter, about my situation, things that would. Vanessa. I said her name quietly, not harshly. I'm not looking for context. Context doesn't change the pattern. She looked at me for a long moment, and then, and I want to be precise about this because it was quite remarkable, she said, I'm married. The 2 words landed on the table between us. I kept my expression neutral. I didn't experience the spike of shock she'd perhaps anticipated, or not visibly, anyway. Internally, I was doing very rapid calculation, running back through 5 months of interactions, noting what this new data point explained and what it didn't. The access to my schedule, the compression of my social life, the control over the edges of my time. She wasn't managing a partner. She was managing a secret. I've been planning to leave him, she continued, and now her composure had developed a crack in it, something urgent and almost desperate coming through. I've been trying to get everything in order. The way I handled things with you, I know it wasn't right, but I was trying to protect something I wanted. I was trying to hold everything together long enough to... Vanessa, I said again. She stopped. That explains the control, I said, but it doesn't change my decision. I paused for a single beat. You should probably tell your husband. Silence. She stared at me. I think she'd expected the revelation to function as a reset, to reframe everything, to generate enough shock and sympathy and complication that the conversation would have to start over from a different place. It was a reasonable calculation. In another person, it might have worked. In me, it had the opposite effect. The revelation didn't complicate my decision. It confirmed it. I stood. She sat for another moment, and then she stood too. We walked to the door with a strange, almost formal quietness. She turned at the threshold and looked at me the way people sometimes look at something they recognize they're seeing for the last time. I'm sorry, she said. And then, you're not going to ask anything? You don't want to know how long, or... No, I said, gently but completely. She left. I closed the door, went back to the kitchen, and sat down with one of the coffees she'd brought. It was still warm. I drank it and looked out the window at the street below and thought about 5 months with considerable clarity. The call from Perry came 3 weeks later. He'd run into someone at a networking event, a man named Graham, who worked in commercial property on the east side of Fenwick. Graham, it turned out, had known Vanessa for years through mutual friends. Perry called me on a Tuesday evening. I could tell from the opening of the conversation that he was uncertain whether what he was about to say would land well or badly. I'm going to tell you something, he said, and I want to preface it by saying I'm not entirely sure what it means. Tell me, I said. This guy, Graham, he said that Vanessa isn't married. Perry paused. He knows her well, apparently. Not intimately, but well enough. He said she's never been married. As far as he knows, she's been single for several years. He seemed quite confident about it. I was quiet for a moment. He thought it was odd when I mentioned it. Perry continued. He said, and I'm quoting here, that the Vanessa he knew wasn't the type to have a husband in the background. Too private was how he put it. Too controlled. I said, Does that mean something to you? I thought about the moment at the kitchen table, the calculation in her pause, the way the revelation had been deployed, precisely, and at the optimal moment in the conversation when a standard persuasion attempt had already failed. I thought about how a woman who had spent 5 months demonstrating an advanced ability to manage information would approach a conversation she'd identified as her highest risk moment. She'd introduced a variable, not to explain herself, not even primarily to make me feel sympathy, but to introduce enough complexity, enough moral ambiguity, enough additional information for me to hold and process, that the certainty of my decision might develop a crack. A married woman planning to leave her husband was a more complicated story than a manipulative girlfriend. It invited questions. It invited reconsideration. It invited the kind of extended conversation in which ground could be gradually recovered. It had been, I had to admit, quite a well-constructed move. It simply hadn't worked because I hadn't been playing the game she thought I was playing. It means, I said to Perry, that even her emergencies were fiction. I took a breath. Impressive commitment to dishonesty. Perry laughed, short and a little odd. That's all you're going to say about it? What else is there to say? The behavior I ended things over wasn't the marriage. The marriage, real or fictional, wasn't the point. The pattern was the point. Right? Perry said. Right, yeah. He paused. I'll be honest, mate. Most people would be at least a little rattled. I'm sure, I said. But being rattled doesn't help anyone. I ran my 4 miles the next morning. The route took me through Fenwick Common and down along the canal path near the Port District, doubling back up through the streets of the Lakeview District and home. It was a cold morning, the tail end of winter, and the canal reflected a pale, flat sky. I thought about Vanessa while I ran, which I generally try not to do, not from any effort at suppression, but because thinking while running tended to produce either very clear thoughts or very circular ones. And I'd found that the difference depended almost entirely on whether you'd already resolved the thing you were thinking about. I had. What I found myself considering, though, was the architecture of it. Vanessa was, by any honest assessment, extraordinarily competent at what she did. The strategy she'd employed was sophisticated. The management of information, the incremental compression of my independence, the careful cultivation of apparent reasonableness throughout, so that each individual act could be isolated and minimized if challenged. The deployment of the marriage, real or otherwise, as a conversion play at the moment of highest danger. These weren't the behaviors of someone acting on impulse. They were the behaviors of someone who had done this before, who had developed a method and refined it, who understood exactly which levers to pull and in what sequence. The question I found genuinely interesting, not troubling, but interesting, was what she'd hoped to achieve. Because control isn't an end in itself. Control is a means. What do you do with someone once you've successfully constrained them? What is the thing you're building toward? I didn't have an answer, and I didn't expect to find one. People have complicated interiors, and Vanessa's were not available to me for examination. But I thought about it, because I believe in understanding the full shape of a thing, even when you're done with it. The canal caught the early light just before I turned back toward home. I picked up my pace. April brought a new contract. A logistics company called Fort Bridge Operating had gotten into a significant dispute with a warehousing consortium over exclusivity terms in their regional agreement, and they'd hired Caldwell and Voss to lead their negotiation. It was complex work, genuinely interesting, involving 3 separate legal jurisdictions and a clause that had been drafted with remarkable ambiguity by, I was reasonably certain, someone who had intended the ambiguity. I liked the work because it required complete attention. There was no room, when you were identifying the structural weaknesses in a commercial contract at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night, for anything that wasn't directly relevant. The mind required for this work was the same mind I tried to maintain in the rest of my life. Calm, precise, oriented toward the actual rather than the imagined. Owen hosted another dinner party in April. 10 people, good bottle of something from the Red Oak Valley region, lamb that someone's girlfriend had apparently spent 4 hours preparing. I sat beside a woman named Petra who worked in architectural restoration and had very strong opinions about a building on the corner of Vine and Dunmore that the city was planning to demolish. She was animated and knowledgeable, and I enjoyed the conversation enormously. Perry was there too, and at one point during the evening, we ended up briefly in the kitchen while the main course was being cleared. "She's at a function tonight," he said, unprompted. He meant Vanessa. I assumed he'd heard it through the same network of mutual adjacents that had produced the Graham conversation. "All right," I said. "You know, people have been talking about how you handled the whole thing," Perry said. He was pouring himself another glass, asking whether you were ever actually bothered. "I was bothered," I said. "I'm not pathologically indifferent, Perry." But he started. "But being bothered isn't the same as being derailed," I said. "The first is just a feeling. The second is a choice." He thought about that. "She apparently told some people you were cold, that you ended things without explanation." I felt a faint appreciation for the consistency of it. Even the post-relationship narrative had been managed. She's not wrong that I ended things, I said. The rest is characterization. You're not going to. Correct, I said. I'm not going to. He smiled. We went back to the table. There's a particular kind of clarity that comes not from resolution, but from disengagement. Not from solving a problem, but from accurately identifying that the problem is no longer yours to carry. I'd found it before at the end of difficult negotiations, at the end of friendships that had outlived their foundations. And I recognized it again in the weeks following April. The Vanessa chapter had closed. Not with drama, not with residue, but with a clean line drawn in the precise place it needed to be drawn. The line held not because I'd been angry enough to hold it or hurt enough to defend it, but because I'd drawn it with an accurate understanding of why it needed to exist. I thought occasionally about the marriage claim. In quieter moments, I found myself returning not to whether it was true, that question had been answered, or close enough, but to the decision to use it, to deploy a claimed marriage as a card in a conversation about control. It suggested a fundamental misunderstanding of what I was responding to. She believed, I think, that my discomfort was with specific events rather than with structure. That if she introduced enough complicating information, an extenuating circumstance, a secret that reframed everything, a sympathetic backstory, the specific events could be renegotiated. But the specific events were never the point. They were evidence of a pattern, and the pattern had been structural, and it had been sustained, and it had been, on some level, deliberate. A compelling reason for any individual incident didn't address the pattern. It just explained one brick in a wall I'd already decided not to stand behind. Even her emergencies were fiction. I'd said it to Perry in the moment, a clean summation of what the new information actually meant, and I'd heard it the way you sometimes hear something and recognize that it's exactly right. Not because it was cutting or cold, though I understood why it might sound that way from the outside, but because it was precise. Fiction is a craft. It requires effort and imagination and a certain respect for the audience. Vanessa had brought considerable craft to the entire enterprise of our relationship. That was worth acknowledging, even if it changed nothing. May was warm. The city had the particular energy it gets in early summer when the waterfront becomes usable again and the restaurants put their tables outside and people walk along the canal path in the evenings as though they've just remembered it exists. I had dinner with Margot again. She came down for a weekend visit, stayed with a friend of hers in the Whitaker neighborhood, and met me at Pellegrino's on Friday, as though we'd arranged it months in advance, which we had. We sat at my usual table by the window and split a bottle of something the sommelier recommended and ate a great deal of food and talked for 3 hours. She asked whether I was seeing anyone, and I said, not currently. She asked whether I had been, and I said yes, briefly, but that it hadn't worked out. She looked at me for a moment with the particular attention older sisters bring to these declarations, and I met her gaze with equanimity. You seem fine, she said. It wasn't quite a question. I am fine, I said. It was a brief thing that turned out to be more complicated than it appeared. I made a decision, and I stand by it. Was she awful? I considered this genuinely. She was capable, I said, and dishonest in a way that was almost impressive in its complexity. But awful is the wrong word. Awful suggests chaos. This was very organized. Margot studied me with amusement. You know, most people would lead with the feelings when asked that question. Most people haven't sat in as many contract negotiations, I said. She laughed, and we ordered dessert, and the evening moved on the way good evenings do, effortlessly, with the time feeling well used rather than consumed. Walking home along the canal path afterward, the city lit up across the water and a warm wind coming in from the south. I thought about what it meant to know yourself well enough that a sophisticated attempt to reshape you simply doesn't find purchase. It isn't arrogance. It isn't invulnerability. It's just clarity, knowing what the foundation is, knowing where the lines are and why they're there. I had been happy in that relationship for a while. That was worth holding on to alongside everything else. The happiness had been real, even if much of the scaffolding around it hadn't been. I didn't think of those months as wasted. I thought of them as instructive, which is the most useful thing any experience can be. The canal was quiet. I took my time getting home. The Fort Bridge negotiation concluded in late May with terms that were, by any objective measure, significantly better than Fort Bridge had any right to expect going in. The warehousing consortium's attorney was accomplished and prepared, but he'd made a structural error in the second session, conceding a temporal precedent that he perhaps not realized could be extrapolated, and I'd held the thread of it patiently through 4 more sessions before pulling it at exactly the right moment. My colleague on the file, a younger associate named Rita, had watched it happen in real time and come to find me afterward with an expression of almost academic fascination. "You knew 2 weeks ago," she said, "didn't you, that you were going to use that?" "I knew it was there," I said. "I waited until the moment made it most effective." She thought about it. "How do you know when that is?" "When they're already certain they've won," I said. "That's when they stop watching for it." She nodded slowly. "Is it always that deliberate?" I thought about the kitchen table in February, the coffee cups between us, the careful, even tone I kept while making a decision that had been made 3 days earlier, holding it until the moment was right. The 5 months before it, all the noting, all the filing away, all the patient accumulating observation of a pattern before I named it out loud. "Generally, yes," I said. "It's always more effective when it looks like it isn't." She smiled and went back to her desk, and I turned to the window and watched the city for a while, the early summer light falling across the rooftops of the buildings on Callaway Street, and felt with considerable conviction like a man who was exactly where he intended to be. That was all it ever was. Not triumph, not indifference, just the steady, practiced, entirely sustainable satisfaction of knowing your own ground and staying on it.
Thanks for listening.